Andrew Francis, and today I would like to introduce a topic that I think I'll probably keep on coming back to, which is the whole idea of the God who sees. And this is something that we find all throughout the scriptures. Recently I was drawn attention to it again when I was looking at Luke chapter 21, verses 1 to 4. It says, Jesus looked up and saw the rich putting their gifts into the offering box. And he saw a poor widow put in 2 small copper coins. And he said, Truly, I tell you, this poor widow has put in more than all of them. For they all contributed out of their abundance, but she out of her poverty put in all she had to live on. Now there's so much that is being said in that small passage there regarding how God understands wealth, how he understands what people give, and we could go on. But one of the things that struck me yet again was the fact that Jesus, who of course shows us the heart of the God of the universe, the God who created all things, he notices this widow and what she is doing. I think in our day and age, and it's probably been true of every day and age, that people are often so enamored by wealth, enamored by big things, that they forget to see what God sees. I think even as Christians, you'll often hear Christians talk about great ministers that are seeing revival taking place in various nations, or ministers that can attract a crowd of people to come to their churches. And so often we look at those things and we say, wow, God must be at work. And it could have easily been the same with Jesus here in this passage, because here's a person presumably, or various people coming and giving enormous amounts of money. They're giving out of their wealth. And for those of us who are more practical minded, we think to ourselves, well, imagine what we could do for the kingdom of God with such amounts of wealth. It's interesting though, Jesus doesn't see things in that way. Instead, he looks and he points out a lady who is giving what amounts to virtually nothing. He can achieve little as far as anything of a more practical nature is concerned. And yet Jesus says, this woman has given far more than any of the other people put together. And the reason why she's given more, she's given all that she has. Now, a little bit earlier, I spoke about Jesus and Zacchaeus. And again, it's a similar sort of story, isn't it? Because nobody else would have noticed this short man up a tree or taken much notice of him, and those that did notice him and knew about him wouldn't have noticed him. They wouldn't have bothered taking time with him, but Jesus notices him and salvation comes to his house. There's another passage, if we want to go back into the Old Testament, that really struck me. And it struck me so much, I find as I read some of these passages that I'm really reduced to tears, because, as I say, it shows the heart of God. And it tells a story of a lady called Hagar. She's a servant girl. She has no rights. She has to do what she's told. And she's a servant girl of a lady called Sarai, who is married to Abram. And of course, Abram later becomes Abraham, and Sarai becomes Sarah. And so Abraham's been promised that one day he's going to have a child. And this promise has been given to him by God. He's believed the promise, but he's getting older. Sarai's getting older as well. And so she thinks to herself, well, let's do something practical towards fulfilling this promise of God. And often as Christians, we're all a bit like that. We want to help God out. And so she says to Abram, well, Abram, why don't you just have sex with my servant girl and produce a child that way? And in that culture, that child would have been seen as Abram's and Sarai's child. And so Hagar, whether she wanted to or not, is sent off to have sex with this very old man. She conceives. And sadly for her sake, she feels pretty good about herself that she's managed to get pregnant, and she starts to look with contempt on her mistress, Sarai. Sarai complains to Abram and says, well, you know, what's going on here? I send this girl into you, and now she's looking down on me. And Abram says, well, you do what you want with her. It's your servant girl. And it says in verse 6 of this chapter 16 of Genesis, it says, then Sarai dealt harshly with her, and she fled from her. As I say, this lady has no rights, she has no support networks, she has nothing apart from what her master and her mistress provide for her. It's something that probably people in poorer countries might understand, but often people in the Western world, such as countries like Australia where I live, there's all sorts of provision offered to people in distress and difficulty. But for a servant girl in that day and age, this was not the case. But it says in verse 7, it says, the angel of the Lord found her by a spring of water in the wilderness, the spring on the way to Shur. And he said, Hagar, servant of Sarai, where have you come from and where are you going? And she said, I'm fleeing from my mistress Sarai. The angel of the Lord said to her, return to your mistress and submit to her. The angel of the Lord also said to her, I will surely multiply your offspring so that they cannot be numbered for multitude. And the angel of the Lord said to her, behold, you are pregnant and shall bear a son. You shall call his name Ishmael, because the Lord has listened to your affliction. He shall be a wild donkey of a man, his hand against everyone, and everyone's hand against him, and he shall dwell over against all his kinsmen. So she called the name of the Lord who spoke to her, You are a God of seeing. For she said, truly, here I have seen him who looks after me. Therefore the well was called Beer Lahairoi. It lies between Kadesh and Bered. What an amazing story. As we know, Ishmael is often referred to, and later on in the New Testament, as the human way of doing things rather than God's way of doing things. Ishmael, of course, has led to the birth of the Arab people, who are still at war with the chosen people of God, the Jewish people. And you'd think that when you realise that, and you realise the thousands of years of conflict between these two groups of people, it's understandable that people would say, well, why would God even care about this child that actually represents those things that seem to be opposed to God? But the reality is, God does care about all people, even those that seemingly are opposed to his plans. God could easily have allowed Hagar to just die in the wilderness, to go without water, to do nothing for her. And she and the child within her would have died, and that would have been that, and there would be no more conflict between these two people groups. Presumably there'd probably be others, but nonetheless. But instead, God sees the distress of this woman. He knows that the child born within her is not the result of human godliness or faith. He knows that she had no ability to decide whether this was the way that it should be. But he knows and he sees and he cares for this lady and her child. So much so he sends an angel to point out a well to her. So much so that this angel prophesies about this child and the things that are going to be accomplished through this child. The God that we worship and believe in is a God who sees. One of my prayers often is that I will also be like God in this matter, and that I will see the things that he sees, that I will not be so enamored, whether it's within the church or within the world, about the things that seem powerful and big and mighty, about the things that seem to cost a lot of money. There's a bit of a story that I've heard told, I'm sure it's not a true story, I'd say it's a bit of a joke, about a conversation between St. Thomas Aquinas and the Pope of the time. And the Pope shows St. Thomas Aquinas all the wealth of the church, and he points to it and he says, no longer can people say, silver and gold have I none. And St. Thomas Aquinas says back to the Pope, and no longer can the people of God say, rise up, take up your mat and walk. And as I say, I'm sure this is probably not a true story, but I suspect that often because of our inability to see beyond wealth, our love of money, our love of riches, our inability to truly trust in God, we fail to both experience what God has for us and to see what God sees. We don't see in the weak and the poor and the lonely the work of God. We don't see in those that are despised and rejected, whose lives are full of sin and suffering, that God might indeed have a deep concern for them, that God might want to draw our attention to those people more even than those who might come into our midst or offer us great wealth. We might, instead of seeing those people, we often see those that perform great miracles, those that speak very well, those that are outwardly attractive. And I would suggest that if we really want to see with the heart of God, that we will shift our gaze. We'll say, God, show me what it is that you're seeing. Help me to see as you see. Open my eyes to those that are suffering and struggling, those that are sick and poor. And as I see, God, help me to have the courage to do with those people what you do with them. Whether like Hagar, to point out that well of water that they so desperately need to continue living. Or like Hagar, to have words of encouragement and prophecy to let her know that God cares. Or like the widow with the 2 coins, to value what she has to give far more, even though it seems so insignificant, but to value that far more than to value enormous amounts of riches that somebody who can easily give that will do. And I think sometimes, when we look at, say, Bill Gates, for instance, and we consider the billions of dollars that he's able to give to the poor, we say, wow, what an awesome thing that man's doing. And I don't want to take away from what Bill Gates is doing or from the gifts that he's offering. But I wonder, is God not doing far, far more through others that might have so little to offer, that might be offering their last coins, their last food, their last bit of effort to make a difference and to honour God in their fellow human beings? May it be our prayer that we see as God sees. God bless you.